It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy every opportunity I have to get back to Australia and to Tasmania. So this was a great chance, the collaboration with Sue. And I just want to say at the outset that, this wasn't something that developed, these concepts didn't develop from some theorizing about this at all. I'm an empiricist. I observe forests and from that learn lessons about how could we manage our forests in ways that are more ecologically beneficial or at least less impactful. And what's happened over time is that very clearly there is a large body of knowledge, and now there is a significant body of practical trial and application of that makes it clear that there really is a rather fundamentally different approach to the management of forests than the traditional approach that has been taken in forestry, which was focused fundamentally on the production of wood, traditionally, and today has become very much a focus on the very efficient production of wood using agronomic models rather than natural models, and basically being driven very much by the current dominant economic model, which is manage to produce a high return on invested capital. Okay, and so it's very clear that what we're talking about with ecological forestry is something that's very different. It isn't based on agronomic models. It isn't based on trying to maximize return on investment. It is designed to try to provide for sustained production of environmental, economic, and cultural values, because that's really what we have to do with the majority of our forest land. So, anyway, on to talking about ecological forestry. A lot of people have contributed to it. As I spoke last night, why we're doing it. Well, we've shifted in what we want as a society, and we've really dramatically expanded what we understand about these ecosystems. And in the old days, it was about wood. But today, a lot of our interest is in maintaining habitat for biological diversity. A lot of our concern with forests these days is their value in watershed protection. And as you become more interested in an array of ecological values, and still interested, but less dominantly so in wood production, then you really have to think again about how should we manage these forests? And the way to think then is to go back and take a look at the forests. How did these systems produce this very broad array of goods and services that we value so much? How did nature do integrated management? And so that's the concept of going back to natural models. Not necessarily that you're going to grow the forest precisely following the way nature did it. We aren't. We have other goals that we want to integrate, but we can learn from how these natural systems work and use those models in designing much more beneficial kinds of silvicultural practices. So we're going to use it on actually probably the majority of the global forest estate is probably where this is appropriate. We're going to use it when we want to restore values that we've lost, where we want to integrate multiple values, including ecological, economic, and cultural, and where we want to reduce risk and increase societal options. And that's something that almost all of us want to do these days, certainly on lands that belong in one way or another to a broader array of people as opposed to simply a company. And basically it's going to utilize principles from natural forests, natural stand developed principles. It's going to utilize what we know about forest disturbances and how they work. And we're going to be paying attention to the spatial scales that we do this as. As Tom Spees was talking last night, he was talking about how in the old days we didn't really pay any attention to anything but the stand. Or if you were an aquatic biologist, the stream reach. And now we really understand we've got to be thinking about that entire landscape. And for some objectives, you have to be thinking about entire regions. That's the only way you can deal with some of these things. Among the important processes at stand development level are disturbances and how they work, and the population dynamics of the tree species. And for us, we had a wonderful object lesson May 18th, 1980, when Mount St. Helens erupted, and we thought we were going to have a moonscape, and instead we had an incredible survival of organisms and structures, because natural disturbances, even volcanic eruptions, don't consume all of this material. They tend to kill things, but a great many of organisms survive, and a great deal of the organic matter survives, and some of it's in the form of those structures that we call snags and down logs. And our work at St. Helens led us to think about other things like fire, and fire works the same way. It leaves behind incredible legacies of living and dead. There's a stand replacement fire. Even in the stand replacement fire, mature, old trees survive and become a source of propagules, for example. But also, there's an incredible legacy of dead material that's very significant in terms of both ecosystem processes and in terms of habitat. I was taught in forestry school 60 years ago that clear cutting is just like a wildfire. Does this look like a clear cut? No, it really doesn't. And wind throw events, the same thing, except with windstorms, nothing is removed. It's simply shifted in terms of where it is. A lot more of it's on the ground. But interestingly, the entire ground floor, including any tree regeneration, is left largely intact, except, of course, that's struck directly by falling material. Insect outbreaks, the same way. Natural disturbances kill trees, but they don't consume a lot of the material. And we developed the concept of biological legacies. And some of these legacies carry over for very long time periods. In our forest, the dead legacies of a fire are going to persist in the development of that new forest for at least 150 years. So, very significant. We have to think about, in each of our different forest types, the scale of disturbances and the type of disturbances, because the legacies are going to vary. And in some of our forest systems, disturbances tend to be at the scale of the individual tree or the gap. Gap systems are very common. This is Northophagus forest in Chile, as a matter of fact. Very much a gap-driven system. Our forest systems tend to be a lot like your mountain ash forest, large-scale stand disturbances. And obviously, different types of disturbances are going to have different kinds of legacies. And the clear cut, of course, traditionally has none. And this is one of the really important distinctions between production forestry and ecological forestry. In ecological forestry, biological legacies provide for continuity, structure, function, biodiversity between generations of forest. Nature doesn't terminate and start all over fresh. Instead, there is a continuity between generations. And in production forestry, of course, our goal is to create discontinuity between generations of forest. Terminate the forest and start over again. That's not what we do in ecological forestry. When we have a stand replacement forest, like mountain ash, or like Douglas fir forests in the Northwest, often we have very severe disturbances which do kill the majority of the trees. We call it a stand replacement disturbance. And then we get very, very long developmental patterns that go on for literally centuries in our case, for several centuries as well in the case of the mountain ash. And go through early development stage, which isn't dominated by trees at all, but is a pre-tree canopy stage. We call this an early seral community. Then a dense forest, one that ultimately comes to be completely dominated by conifer trees, and very low in biological diversity. It matures. It begins to undergo gap kinds of developing processes from insects, from disease, from wind, and eventually becomes an older forest which is quite structurally complex. It has a lot of individual kinds of structural elements, but it's also spatially heterogeneous. It's not a uniform stand, that the trees are well spaced out. Instead, it's extremely patchy in terms of the way in which those structures are distributed. And these systems are complex, and they're very rich in terms of biological diversity. So, a different kind of forest, and one that we deal with in the Northwest, and you deal with in parts of Australia, are forests that are subjected to frequent low severity disturbances. And the classic example of this is a forest that is subject to frequent fire. The finest example of this in North America is the longleaf pine ecosystem, which is one that's subject to very frequent fire, and I mean frequent. These forests must burn every 1 to 3 years, or they begin to change. And these are very much systems that involve individual tree mortality, clusters of mortality, and again, they're subject to frequent fire. Incidentally, these are the most biodiverse temperate forests that I know of. They have incredible rich understories. But they have a very distinctive pattern, as do our ponderosa pine forests in the western United States, of being dominated by a community of large, old pine trees. Low density, dominantly large trees, dominantly older trees. And again, maintained by fire. And interestingly, they tend to develop a very heterogeneous pattern as well. And they are fundamentally gap-based kinds of systems. So, those are two examples then of stand development and disturbance regimes from which we can draw models, from which we can design our silvicultural systems. Now, mind you, one thing about those very long-lived systems is that we have to be sure that we provide for all stages of the forest. We need the early seral ecosystem, we need the old forest system, and all the stages of development in between, if we're going to sustain all the processes and organisms that are a part of them. Now, the little cartoon was my point of saying, okay, how do we actually incorporate this into forestry practices? And we do it by beginning to do things like incorporating biological legacies into our regeneration harvests, by beginning to model our treatment of established stands on natural stand development processes, and by maintaining appropriate recovery periods between our activities. When we first started talking about ecological forestry, we talked about this three-legged stool. Basically, biological legacies, stand manipulations modeled on natural stand development, and appropriate rotations or return intervals. There's a fourth leg to this stool. In this old cartoon of mine, it's not there, but that's the landscape level context. And we're not going to try to perfectly model natural ecosystems, but we are going to draw lessons from them. First leg of the stool was structural retention, and it's about biological legacies. It's about providing for continuity of structure and function. Now, I have to remind my students that, I know it sounds to you like, this is telling you we discovered water runs downhill. To discover that, in fact, you can leave trees behind and it makes a difference. But in fact of matter, particularly in the Douglas fir region, this was heresy. You would manage a forest and leave trees behind at the time of harvest? What nonsense! But that's exactly what we begin to do. And we begin to think about, instead of removing all or most of the trees as we do in the even-aged approaches, or just doing single tree selection as is done at the other end of the scale, we begin to think about the center of this continuum of either removal or retention, which incidentally we have very few silvicultural terms to describe. We're trying to do a whole bunch of things with retention. We're trying to lifeboat diversity. We want to structurally enrich the new stand rather than have it be a simple one. We want to improve landscape connectivity. And again, it's about continuity. And this little lungless salamander illustrates the point. It doesn't really care if you harvest its forest, as long as you leave behind some of these well-decayed, water-soaked logs that are its essential habitat. That's part of what biological legacies are about. And structural enrichment means that the stand, instead of being very simple, uniform in terms of the tree size and condition, has, in fact, a diversity of tree sizes and conditions. And that, for example, in our case, allows the northern spotted owl to come back much more quickly. This was not received with open arms by foresters when we began to talk about this 30 years ago. And this was the typical reaction. Oh, we can't do that. It'll all blow down, it won't work. We can't get reproduction. But in effect, it turns out to be a very flexible kind of an approach for, in fact, maintaining incredible continuity of habitat and function in forest systems. And the silvicultural prescription is a very simple one in concept. You only have to answer 3 questions. What should I retain? How much of it? And in what spatial patterns should I retain it? For us, the answer to the first question in 1980s was very simple. We weren't going to grow any big old trees, and therefore we weren't going to have any big old stags or big old down logs on the forest floor. So we'd better save some of those. We'd better retain those. And that was easy to answer the question. How much should we retain? Well, that's a very complicated question, but it began with the notion that you have to leave enough structure behind to be credible so that you can pass the laugh test that no, this is not a clear cut. It really is something different, and it is going to behave differently. And so, obviously then, varying levels of retention. The third element of the prescription is a fun one, which is, how should I leave it? Should I leave it this way, evenly distributed? And this was my first thought about it. Oh yeah, I know, I'll do like a shelter would, but I'll leave the trees there forever. And so a nice uniformly distributed one, 15% retention. But in fact of matter, that does some things very well, but probably it's not the most effective way of maintaining the majority of biological diversity. And so I began to think about leaving patches of forest behind. And incredibly enough, it was the Darth Vader of the wood products industry in our country. You know Darth Vader, Star Wars, and there was this company, Plum Creek Timber Company, who was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal as the Darth Vader of the wood products industry because of the clear cutting they were doing. And so they came to me and said, what can we do to change both the perception and the reality of what we're doing? I talked with them about this, and they began to try different approaches. And they were the ones that actually revealed to me the incredible value that might come from not leaving individual trees by themselves, but strips and patches behind. Actually little aggregates of forest, little islands of forest. And this was the first such unit that I saw of that kind. Here's an example of it in which you have both dispersed and aggregated retention. And it turns out that aggregated retention is both very efficient from a management point of view, works well from the standpoint of harvesting, safety issues, economic issues, and it also is probably, if you have no other choice, the most cost-efficient way of, the most ecologically efficient way of sort of maximizing the amount of biodiversity that you lifeboat per investment of retained wood. In other words, this is a very efficient way to lifeboat a broad array of organisms and processes in the system. So, spatial retention is one of the important aspects of the silvicultural prescription. And this is the kind of prescription that my collaborator and I are really proposing these days for regeneration harvesting, actually with the goal of creating early seral habitat. That's our main ecological objective. But this is about 30% retention in little patches, and then you can see that there's also some riparian buffers that go up into the unit. About 30%. Second leg of the stool I'll go through very fast. This is manipulating established stands, using natural stand development principles to direct them. And the important thing about this is that the difference between, for example, thinning for ecological objectives and thinning for wood production objectives is that instead of doing it uniformly, as we would normally do to create, a wonderful opportunity for trees to grow faster, we're actually going to do variable density. Instead of uniformity, we're going to try to create heterogeneity. Instead of just assisting the biggest trees in the forest, we're also going to try to assist the trees and the vegetation at intermediate and low levels in the forest. And a real challenge for the forester doing ecological forestry, we're going to try to create heterogeneity or complexity. Now that's exactly the reverse of what we try to do in production forestry, where we try to create uniformity. So in our thinnings, instead of that kind of thinning, we're going to do more of that kind of thinning. It creates more open areas and dense areas and a variety of conditions in between. Hard to depict in a photograph, but different than commercial thinning. And often we're going to be cutting some large trees as well as some small ones, because that's the only way you can help trees and shrubs and plants that are at intermediate and lower levels in a forest. So we're going to be thinking about that. Example 2 of taking established stands and manipulating them according to ecological principles. The pine forests, which now have become incredibly dense and overstocked as a result of the fact that we stopped fire. So that beautiful forest that we had of pines, the pines are still here. They're still there. But they're embedded in this dense forest of younger trees that provide ladder fuels, so that when they burn now, they're going to burn and die because the fire is going to be so hot. And if they don't die of fire, they're going to die of competition. There's that last big old pine surrounded by all of these young Douglas firs and grand firs. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to restore those forests by, in fact, opening them out, creating a much more widely spaced situation so that the trees won't burn up when, in fact, a fire comes. And here's an example of a forest that's just in the process of being restored. And you begin the restoration in these forests by actually retaining all of the big old trees that are still there. And you use them to anchor your silvicultural prescription as you restore appropriate densities and appropriate fuel loadings in those stands. And of course, you restore fire. The third leg of the stool simply has to do with using appropriate return intervals from an ecological perspective. And traditionally, rotations have been based on culmination of mean annual increment. More recently, it's based on an economic rotation. That's how production forestry is done. And when you do that, you take a forest system like our Douglas fir system that has maybe a natural rotation on an average of 300 to 400 years, and you reduce it to something like the lower figure. You eliminate all of the olders. That's not an appropriate kind of a return interval. But I've realized it's not just about rotations. The principle in ecological forestry is appropriate return intervals for the ecological process of concern. And so the appropriate return interval for the silviculturalist in longleaf pine is every 2 or 3 years to return with fire, because that system will change if you don't. So I'm just going to skip down to one other element that I want to be sure that I touch on, and that is the landscape. And Tom should be up here speaking about the landscape, but the fourth leg of the stool in ecological forestry is the landscape context. And it starts by looking at the landscape and identifying those areas that have special value from an ecological and cultural perspective. Identifying them and determining what kind of treatments would be appropriate. Okay? Finding those and determining the appropriate management regime to protect those values. And of those, overwhelmingly the most important are the aquatic features in these landscapes. The streams, the rivers, the lakes, the ponds. Other aspect that I wanted to be sure to touch on was the notion of what kind of a landscape that we are trying to create. Now, interestingly, the vision of the conservation biologist, the environmentalist, and that of the timber forester is about the same. They see a landscape as black and white, habitat and not habitat. Okay? Conservation biology Academic conservation biology and island biogeography is about a black and white view of the world. And it assumes that habitat islands in a terrestrial landscape are like islands in an ocean. So maybe here the black is what's considered to be suitable habitat. The rest is sterile. It's non-habitat. Foresters like this in the old days as well. If I have to deal with biodiversity, I'll set up some preserves for it. And then I won't have to worry about it anymore, and I can do whatever I want in the non-habitat. I can be just as hard as I want to be. Okay? And I had a discussion here in Australia with the Chief of the Forest Service in 1982, based on exactly that. I said, Chief, aren't you worried about biodiversity, especially with the new law? He says, no, it's not a problem. We just need to set some areas aside, and then we can do as we please. He was serious. Well, if you have a view of the world as the world being black and white, and you operate on that basis, then you will create a world that is black and white. Habitat and not habitat. But in the real world, that's not the way it is when nature creates a mosaic. And so what we really need to be thinking about is that landscape as being a mosaic of shades of gray, or even better, shades of green. And how we do this is, for example, by making the areas we log, our logging coops, not sterile environments, but by doing retention and maintaining structural complexity within it, we make it not perfect habitat, but habitat that can sustain elements of biodiversity, that can provide connectivity for others. And so that's the vision of an ecological forestry landscape. And we do this by, in fact, managing using ecological forestry principles. And essentially, by no longer doing the traditions of production forestry, clear felling, essentially eliminating other elements and growing dense plantations. This is what we're doing on our production forestry lands in Oregon, in Washington. And it creates that black and white landscape. And what we want is shades of green. So I'll quit at that point.